Well, it is 4:30, so I will go ahead and call this to order for today and get us going. Call to order. That sounds like we're doing Robert's rules. We're not doing Robert's rules. Hi, I'll start this over. Hey, it's 4:30, so I'm going to go ahead and get going, even though I'll hear the Zoom ding ding of people entering probably for the next few minutes here. But our agenda for tonight is going to be a little more fluid than normal because the very first thing that we're supposed to start off with tonight, the presenter for that is still dropping kids off. So Becky will be here in a little bit. So we're really going to launch into that 5 to 5:45 chunk first, and then we'll backtrack and take a break, and that'll put us back on track. Becky and I both talked about it, and we have a funny feeling that we probably will be done before 7:30 tonight, which I know is going to disappoint all of you. Because I know there's nothing more fun after a long day of teaching than getting into an online meeting for another 3 hours. But I promise, I promise this will be a Christmas present in disguise. And this unit is a great unit. So I'm really looking forward to going through it with you guys as we do every 6 weeks or so here. The agenda tonight does cover parts and components of lessons 1, 2, and 3 from Unit 4, which is mostly over the creation and rise of empires. We get a little bit into the fall of empires. We also get a little bit into the fall of empires in Unit 6 as well. That was Phil and I being a little schizophrenic when we were writing these units, but we felt like there were some components that belonged here and some components that belonged in that Era 4 unit. So this one sort of bridges that divide. And when we come back together in January, we'll actually be tackling Unit 5, which is on religion, which we've said all along could go in many different places. So um, we'll save that complex unit for next time. But tonight we are definitely getting into the rise of empires, and we're excited to do this with you. So, without further ado, I am skipping the 4:40 to 5 o'clock portion for now. We will backtrack to it. And we're going to actually just jump right into the Unit 4 overview. So, for those of you that haven't been to the Giant site in a while, we're still making some fine tuning, or we're still doing some fine tuning. I did want to point out that for your K2 teachers, if there are any wonderful kindergarten, first, or second grade teachers in your life, we have a new button on the page for K2 Giants, which is all in beta. And it's going to look very, very differently, but there's definitely some stuff for your kindergarten, first, and second grade teachers to check out that will continue to grow and develop as we move through. But none of you are kindergarten, first, or second grade teachers, or if you are, you have the weirdest job description ever. So I'm going to go into Giants seventh grade. I'm going to hover over that button and I'm going to go to Unit 4. And actually, I'm first going to go to the pacing view. The pacing view for this unit shows that Unit 4 should take roughly about 6 weeks of instruction. And not knowing where any of you are right now in the Giants units, 6 weeks is our rough guesstimate, but it's also generally the rule of thumb for most Giants units. That's roughly how long these particular units of instruction go, which means on average, you'll spend about 2 weeks on each of the lessons that are within this unit. So if I click on Unit 4, I'm going to start right off with the unit overview. And our compelling question for this particular unit this time around is, what conditions are likely to make an empire successful? And you can see we've got the laundry list. We've got all the W3s here in this particular unit. All the W3s are going to be addressed. Some of the W3.1s are also going to be addressed in Unit 6 as we get more into the Fall of Empires. But we do have the beginnings of the Fall of Empire in this unit as well. So with Unit 4, just know that this is a long unit and it's going to be complemented with a long unit on religion, which will then also be complemented with another long unit that brings the story that we start to tell in this unit to a close before we finish strongly with the performance task. unit. So that's kind of what you're in for tonight. For the unit overview, we're really going to be focusing our attention on what conditions are likely to make an empire successful. And if you recall from previous rollouts, we've done conditions and connections work multiple times at multiple grade levels. So this is a really good launch pad from some of those earlier conversations and some of the earlier units. As far as lesson one goes, because on the agenda, I was going to do that flyby unit four overview and then move right into lesson one. Um, as far as lesson one goes, the first lesson, the supporting question that backs up the compelling question this time around is civilization and empire. So, what's the difference? And this is Dr. Gershmel and I had a lot of fun conversations over this particular topic and how much we sometimes didn't actually appreciate the way that the content expectations were set up for seventh grade because it feels like all of this stuff should blend together. And we did, in fact, blend a lot of this stuff together. So this was a great opportunity for us to make one of the supporting questions for this unit in particular really center in on the idea of okay, so we've talked about civilizations, we've talked about hunters and gatherers before that. Now we're going to talk about empires. What really is the difference between these two things? So we centered all of lesson one over this. You can see we've got a Unit 4 overview presentation, a very short Unit 4 student journal this time. There's too many good activities. We didn't want to keep throwing them into this overarching Google Doc, but it will help you as you go through the unit presentation to have that student journal. And I am finishing up the compelling and supporting questions. So for those of you who are printing those off and putting them up in place of or in concert with your learning targets, just know that the Unit 4 ones are coming. I've got several meetings over the next few days where I might be able to multitask. No, Tom, not the one I'm in with you. There will be no multitasking in that one, I promise. But I do have several others. Any of you who have ever been in a meeting with the Department of Education know there's lots of great opportunities to kind of branch out and work on stuff that you've got coming up. So stay tuned for the compelling and supporting question posters for this unit, but they will be available hopefully before you meet it. Phil's going to talk a little bit about geometry of an empire, the growth of the Myra Empire in South Asia. This first portion, after I'm done in a couple of minutes here, is going to be very Phil heavy, which is good because he's the person you're really here to see. He's the prime rib. I'm the baked potato. Goodness, that was a terrible analogy. Okay, so we will serve the prime rib with Phil in just a few minutes here, but I did want to point out that this lesson is long. There's lots of great stuff in it. And we've done some significant retooling of certain portions of it even in the last week. So if you jumped into this lesson 3 weeks ago, and you were like, oh man, I'm going to use this, just know it's probably been updated because we did some pretty significant changes, particularly to the part that I have on the screen right now, within the last week or so, with a few more still coming, right, Phil? He's nodding. So, yes. All right. So overall, in lesson one, we're really going to be focusing in on the difference between a civilization and an empire, talking about characteristics of both. We've got some great geography activities that really help drive this home in conjunction with some of the non-geography based activities that marry together nicely. And that sort of brings me to a component that I have only referenced in the past that I'm going to go a little bit further in depth with today. Not super in depth, because again, we've got prime rib waiting in the kitchen. But I wanted to point out that we have for almost all of the Giants grade levels, and seventh grade is no exception. When we pull out a section of Michigan Open Book Project, when we say, hey, read this chapter of Open Book, you don't have to use Open Book. If you have a textbook that you like already, that is fine, that meets your needs, go ahead and use that. Just find the corresponding chapter. But we have, in a lot of cases, referenced Open Book because it's free. It's the sister project of this initiative. And one thing that we have done in a lot of the grade levels is include what we call reading guides. And the reading guides are different from grade level to grade level. You can tell that different grade levels are written by different people. that's totally fine, because it's we want people who are experts in the content working on the development of the units. But seventh grade is no exception. We created these reading guides to go right along with the readings in Open Book. And this is something that a lot of people who have used Open Book have asked for, and it's not really available on the Open Book website. It's all available as part of the Giants units. So just know whatever grade level Giants you approach, whether it's just the seventh grade or if you teach other grade levels as well, 9 times out of 10, if we're telling you to read a section of Open Book, we're also with your kids or have your kids read it, we're also going to be providing reading guides along with them, just as a way to kind of scaffold their thinking as they're going through and, focus in on what the more important parts are. Now, the reading guides for seventh grade were created by the original seventh grade authors, Amy Striegel and Lisa Voss. And I did not do much in the way of changes to most of those reading guides. I really liked how they had set them up. Um, if you've looked at the fifth grade or the eighth grade at all, I did most of those reading guides because I'm a US history guy by trade. And so they look a little bit different, but really it's doing the same thing. It's giving kids something to do while they are reading the materials. This could be a great thing to have kids working on a snow day. Ideally, we won't have any more school is closed because of threats days, but we who knows? So these are great things. If you have kids working virtually, you can just say, you know what, here's access to a reading guide. I want you to work on questions 1 through 6 today, and then go outside and build a snowman. And for the record, I am also one of those people who say it's also okay to just completely ignore any homework on a snow day and go outside and build the snowman. I like both of those things. I did over our 2 snow days here. I did make my I said seventh graders. I just aged them. My fifth graders, my 2 fifth graders, do the schoolwork that got sent home by Remind. But when they were done, I didn't do any of the suggested additional activities. I told them go outside and play and have fun. So, whatever camp you fall into, these are great for in class activities. These are great for online extensions. And usually, when we're asking you to read something in Open Book, we provide these reading guides for you. So, just wanted to take a couple of minutes to highlight that, to spotlight that, so you guys are aware that these are in here. And if you have colleagues that aren't using Giants, but they are using Open Book, let them know to mine the Giants units for their grade level, because more than likely we've got some reading guides available for them. So, any questions on the Unit 1 overview, the Lesson 1 overview, or what I had on the reading guide? Hearing none, I'm actually going to tell the chef in the kitchen to hold the prime rib under the heat lamp for a few minutes, because if that's okay, Chef Phil, because Becky's with us now, so we can backtrack to that portion and then jump into Phil's stuff. Or if Becky needs a minute or Phil's like raring to go, we can continue on with this part and backtrack to Becky later. Chef Philip, what do you suggest? You're muted, so I can't hear what you're saying. And you held something up, and I couldn't see what it was. So,
Well, that was the magazine that I could read for a little while if you want.
well, then sous chef Becky Bush just joined us, and we can, if she's amenable, we will backtrack so that we can stay in some semblance of the agenda. We'll backtrack to the what did we call it? We had this cute little title, Introspection with Dave and Becky. Becky, are you ready to launch into this? I did link the handout that you sent to me this afternoon in the agenda.
Yes, I can. I'm hoping that you might be willing to make me a co-host so I can share my screen.
I think I can make that happen. There you go. You should be co-host. And welcome, Becky.
So this is just I just wanted to spend a couple of minutes talking about spec. Dave, I'm not sure what kind of description you gave before everyone got started. I apologize. I had to get my kid to the gym for gymnastics practice. But is there anything that you want to share before we jump in?
No, I made several really bad cooking analogies, and that was the extent of things. So,
Okay, great, great. Okay, so we'll just jump right in. SPEC is a strategy that I learned from a very good friend of mine, Dr. Anthony Fitzpatrick, and I use it a lot when I'm working with students. I use it a lot when I'm working with teachers, with my pre-service teachers that I work with at Hope and MSU, because what I think you get out of SPEC the most is the organization, the level of organization that you get when you have students really start to organize their thoughts. And this is just one way for them to do it in a way that kind of lends itself to not only helping them get their thoughts down in an organized way, but also to help structure their writing. If you get to a point where you want them to be engaging in informative essay writing or argumentative essay writing, I find that it comes in handy in that circumstance as well. Dave, jump in if there's anything that you want me to add, or if you want to add something that you've heard me talk about before that I'm not thinking about. I use this state standard as an example of how to work with the SPEC strategy. I took this one because it is extremely transparent. So if you have any experience teaching 8th grade, perhaps in a former life, before you came over to the world history and geography side of things, you will see that the U421 is an 8th grade state standard. And it really is all about comparing the Northeast and the South. Obviously, this is prior to the Civil War, but it sets students up for making those comparisons, not just from a geographic standpoint, but also from the result of that, the result of development in very different ways between the Northeast and the South. So here a standard is written, and you can clearly see that it's written in the form of SPEC, if you will. So if we take a look at it from the standpoint of how do I introduce something like SPEC to my students, I would say, here's an example. Ask students to jot down on a piece of scrap paper reasons for westward migration. And I'd give them a couple of minutes and say, list everything you can think of as far as reasons why people would choose to move westward. And they might come up with some of these, overcrowding in some of the urban cities, poor living conditions, technological developments. Maybe they just wanted more space, right? They were tired of being crowded. Advances in transportation made them see that was a possibility, right? So as they start to list some of those factors, that's when we start to address SPEC as a strategy. And so we say, we have this huge list on the board of all of these possible reasons why. folks decided to move westward. And so let's kind of put some organization to all of these thoughts that we have up here. And so this is where SPEC comes in. And so I make sure that we have time to really go into a lot of examples of each of these categories or characteristics. So I spend some time talking about each one, making sure to differentiate between the social and the cultural. And again, this is where we spend a lot of time with many examples. And then after we go through SPEC and what SPEC represents, then we take the content that we had put up on the board and we start to analyze it for its SPEC significance. So I might have a chart that I would give to students that again would be a reminder right there of each, the S, the P, the E, the C, right, with some examples. And then in the below that in the column, they could list pertinent examples from what we had put up on the board. And so again, we're talking about westward migration. We might talk about, well, someone mentioned political corruption. Where do you think that would go in our SPEC chart? Most students are probably going to say it would go into the political category. But every once in a while, even with something as concrete or what seems to be concrete, like political corruption, we'll have a student that might say, well, I think it should go in the economic category as well. And again, we ask why? Why do you think about it from an economic standpoint? And again, listen to their rationale. SPEC is a very powerful strategy, not only because it can help students organize their ideas and their thinking, but also because it requires justification or rationale. And to get students really talking about their thought process is invaluable in a lot of respects. Several years ago, some teachers that I was working with really were having a hard time making sure that they were always addressing the spatial thinking that was accompanying a lot of the temporal thinking. And so they added the G for geography to the SPEC, because oftentimes there are periods in our history, in world history, or there are people and their influences where geography is a huge factor in what leads to a social repercussion or a social effect or a political effect. And so they wanted to make sure that the geography was acknowledged for the important role that it can sometimes play. And so we have students who are spectacular, and we have teachers and students who G-spec. The preference is all yours, but I have seen the SPEC strategy used as early as third grade. And I've seen it used all the way through high school. So really almost every age group or grade level can begin to investigate SPEC in thoughtful and meaningful ways with regard to our state standards and content expectations that accompany those. The key to make SPEC work is to, again, engage those standards in different ways and to scaffold some of those skills and continue to spiral it so it continues to unlock deeper meaning. So, we talk about often If students are using the SPEC strategy in elementary school, imagine how their thinking can continue to grow into some real critical thinking levels by the time they get into middle school. So again, it's a strategy that can be used all the way through. And again, most teachers use it to generate ideas, but they also will use it for some of these things, like they'll use it to structure graphic organizers, again, to help students organize their thinking. They will use it in scavenger hunts. They will sometimes use it as an extension into an interactive notebook. Or they'll use it to help students make generalizations. And ultimately, I think the number one reason why I like using this particular strategy is because it's just a natural progression into the writing process. So we have students can develop a broad spectrum of their thesis statements and their conclusions. And in doing so, they can demonstrate their mastery of the content as well as their historical and geographic thinking capabilities as well. So again, when you think about it, Dave, I apologize. I didn't use a cooking analogy. I used the house analogy in that,
How dare you?
I know, I'm sorry. I just went rogue. A house can't be built on a weak foundation, right? And so when we talk about writing, whether it's informative or argumentative, that foundation has to be strong. So oftentimes teachers will use that SPEC strategy to help students organize their thinking and to help land on what they feel is going to be their strongest thesis statement that they can develop. Now, again, if you do the math, if you think about S, P, E, and C each having its own body paragraph, then you do end up with, or could end up with, a 6-paragraph essay. So you have to convince yourself going in that the world will not stop if you do a 6-paragraph essay as opposed to a 5-paragraph essay. But other than that, SPEC really pays off dividends in helping students formulate what they want to say, and then also helping them be organized in the way that they want to say it or express it. So again, going back to our first example, when we started things off about folks moving westward, if I ask a compelling question, I'm also really helping students set up their thesis statement as they work towards answering the compelling questions. And then they can play around with strategy. And if they feel that, for example, maybe the political perspective is the strongest, maybe they want to lead with that. Maybe they want to save their strongest argument for last. Their choice, right? But again, it's causing them or requiring them to really organize their thinking and to think through all of the arguments that they want to make from a variety of perspectives. So again, if you take a look at the C3 framework, I just pulled one that is a natural example of what SPEC can do as far as a strategy. This one comes from the second dimension of the framework. And this is really starting with the indicator number 4. It's really geared toward, there are a few on that page and in that category that are all about perspectives and multiple perspectives. So again, I just wanted to show an example of the thinking skills that are referenced in the C3 that can go hand in hand with the spec strategy. And that's it.
So Becky, one thing I'm wondering if you could take a minute to talk about. I've done some spec work with my teachers before. The joke is I plagiarize a book for my professional development every year. And a few years ago, it was text inspection on the core. But one thing that I noticed in working with them is that even some of my teachers, myself included, sometimes had trouble distinguishing, gosh, is this social? Is this cultural? Which is it and why? So would you take a second to kind of give us the Becky Bush version of that, the Bush addendum to spec, so that we know what to look for?
Sure. Dave, right along with you, we've had several conversations about that, just that, what makes one different from the other. And really, when I'm working with pre-service teachers, I'll say, think about social as, again, some of the bigger issues, bigger ideas that tend to be consistent throughout multiple societies. So, for example, most societies have a legal system of some sort, right? Most societies have public goods and or services. Most societies have institutions like education. So those tend to be social, those issues that most societies share. Now, they might look different, but they're kind of the basics as part of any society. Whereas cultural, here's where we always see a lot of variance. These are the kinds of things that are tangible representations of what happens when people within a society or even a sub-society come together and interact. So these are the kinds of things that are going to possibly vary, like art, music, writing, poetry, other forms of entertainment. So when we start to talk about it in those terms, and then we start to really throw around a lot of examples, right? So the education system, then they start to hone in on, okay, that is social, right? We sometimes will take a standard and we'll put it in. We'll start to put it in one category and then talk about the kind of rationale that one might make for it to be in another category. And it's very possible that sometimes we could be discussing issues or characteristics that fall into all 4 categories in one way or another. When teachers introduce the spec strategy, a lot of times, whereas I started today with the theme of movement, really, and the movement of people, often teachers who introduce it for the first time will start with a person. So I'll say, list everything you can about Abraham Lincoln. And so we start to talk about, well, he was the 16th president. Okay. So where would you place that on the chart? And so in doing that, they see that people are multifaceted and there are many different significant characteristics that aren't always going to fall into one category. And so sometimes they feel that starting with a person or a place or one particular event might lend itself a little bit easier to helping students organize their thoughts around SPEC as opposed to something like I was talking about, like westward movement. Does that answer your question or help at all?
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. And I think one of the big things to underscore from that is that sometimes the answer is yes. Sometimes it is social and sometimes it is cultural. And sometimes it's all four of the above. Sometimes it's social, political, economic, and cultural. And you have good conversations with your classes about, what's the evidence that makes it each of these things. So thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Did anyone else have other questions for Becky on the spec strategy? Hearing none, I'm going to thank Becky for that presentation. You can see I've been joined by a guest. Whenever I'm on a Zoom with Becky, for some reason, Newton here comes. I think Newton likes Becky, so someday in real life you'll have to come over because he always comes out when he hears your voice. So but we are now going to turn things over to Phil. We will be back in the agenda where we are supposed to be. And I believe right on time as well. So we're going to turn things over to Phil to talk about empire growth, the Myra, frankincense and empires. And then we'll go back to Becky for her in summation, her skills and stuff with Becky Bush. So with that, I'm going to turn things over to Phil. Philip, take it away.
Well, I'm going to punch share screen and see how that works.
You are now sharing your screen.
And if I take this and do from beginning.
There you go. You're good.
World history. I'm actually kind of glad to be back up in 7th grade. I spent the last month getting ready for a big session of the National Council for Geographic Education about K2. And it's kind of nice to get away from, Dr. Seuss type prose. Phonological awareness. The beast in the east had a feast where he eat meat and other neat stuff. And yet that put me in mind of something, what geography's role is in Unit 4 more than in most of the other units, is to kind of provide the backstop for a lot of the stories that resonate down to the present. Inventions that were made back then that we still use, laws, legal systems, and why they're different in different places. How you can use the facts of the Han Dynasty to help us understand relationships between China and Taiwan today. And that puts me into what the world history map activities are about. They're less about world history than they are about making sure that your kids have the skills that they probably should have gotten if they had giants in 6th grade and in 3rd grade. In other words, some of this is not only topical review, but it's review using exactly the same maps and just using them in a somewhat different way. So as usual, there is a handout, the last page of your handout packet that Dave sent around that has what I'm going to talk about for the next couple minutes, but I'm going to give you the summary first this time, and then take a specific look at 3 of the activities. We also put up on the website a list of definitions because it's terribly easy for this topic to get bogged down in defining terms. And when Dave and I went out and tried to find a couple websites that would be, cool places to send people to find out about these terms, what we found is that some of them were factually wrong, and some of them were so politically slanted that you would have to spend a whole bunch of time kind of recovering from it. So if you've got a problem with definitions, we put up a little word wall. And with that, let me show you a quick thumbnail of the various activities. And then after we get through this list, I'll go into a couple of them that might be a little bit harder and basically just run through the PowerPoint for you. So the one about the growth of the Maurya Empire is a map skill that we actually have in 3rd grade giants and again in 6th grade giants. So they might know this already. It's a very simple process. You basically just draw a line around all the ones and color it a dark color, and then draw a line around all the twos and make it a little lighter color. But we're doing it with an empire that people don't talk about very much. I mean, I mentioned it very briefly when we were introducing the geohistogram, because the city-states that became the Maurya Empire were already so powerful that both the Persians and Alexander the Great basically got up to the edge of their territory, took a look at their army and said, okay, we're not going any farther. In other words, these folks had their act together, at least in Persian time. What students should gain out of doing this is how one empire expanded. But there's also another fact that you could note, and that is this empire expanded until it ran into a difficult geographical barrier. And when it ran into there, it learned an important fact of history. If your military strategy is adapted to the environment where you were, it's not going to be terribly successful when you move into a different environment. I mean, the Romans had their lunch handed to them when they went into the German forests. You know that both Alexander the Great and the Persians came over here and found that fighting in a place that gets a lot of monsoon rain is a whole lot different than fighting in the near desert of Persia or Greece. So that's one activity. It should take you all of, I don't know, 5 or 10 minutes as a prompt. Where do you use it? You could use it at the beginning of talking about the Mauryans in South Asia. You could use it after you've talked about Ashoka and his contributions to the theory of democracy. In other words, there's lots of places to use a little mini activity like that. The frankincense story is pretty much the same kind of thing. This one could take just 5 or 10 minutes. It could be a take-home activity, or you could use the PowerPoint, and I'll show you the PowerPoint a little bit later on. But they basically go step by step to estimate how valuable frankincense was in the Roman economy. Because what you get out of this is that if you want to understand any time in history, you just have to know what the elites are willing to spend a whole lot of time and money to get. And if you want to use Bitcoin as an example today, Bitcoin is basically nothing more than pet rocks for rich people, but it's a whole lot of fun to gamble with it. as possible replacement for money. Give me a break, okay? On the other hand, frankincense was a possible replacement for money in the Roman economy. And we got an activity about that. Major empires in the past is, again, something that could take no more than 10 minutes, and you could do it at the beginning of your discussion of empires. You could do it as step by step for each one of the empires. You could do it as a review or test prep later. All you're doing is matching the names of 8 major empires with the maps that show where they got started and how large they got. I mentioned the Han Dynasty a little bit earlier, and the reason we want to know about these ancient empires, I mean, to be honest, they're just stories about what happened a long time ago until you ask one more question about them. What are the remaining legacies of that ancient empire in the lives of the people today? And there's absolutely no denying that the influence of Ashoka and the Mauryan Empire is still part of the culture of India, that the Confucian focus during the Han Dynasty is part of the Chinese culture today, that the Islamic Empire and the Mongol Empire and the Songhai and Mali empires, each of these empires had legacies that continue until today. The problem is if you don't make sure the students know where that empire was in the world, then they can't start asking the question about what modern countries are likely to have some enduring legacies of that old empire. Now, we're going to talk a whole lot more about legacies in Unit 6 and 7. Right now, our job is to make sure that the students know if I mention the Han Dynasty, where in the world that happened. The other thing that you can get out of looking at these empires here is a little bit about the size that they got to, because only the Mongol Empire got really, really big. And there's a good political reason for that. I'll do a little G-spec on that when we talk about the empires themselves. The objective of this is just to review the general location and the size of these empires so that we can explore their legacies in the modern world. Now, there is a link to the geohistogram. There is a printed activity that is about the empires in different world regions. It's a very simple way to review the times and places in a different way and to and remind people of the memory value of that graphic organizer. And either one of those, the map activity or the geohistogram, is a whole lot more interesting than just handing out a data table. But we put one up on the website in case you'd like to have a little bit more detailed review all on one page for your notes as to where it got started, who were the important people in it, how big did it get, what part of the world was it in, and so on. Then there's 50 reasons for the fall of Rome. And this is basically a list of 50 reasons for the fall of Rome. I'll either do that at the end of this hour if I'm still ahead of the schedule, or I'll do it at the beginning of the next hour. And geometry of the empire is the main topic of the next hour. Now, Dave mentioned it right away in lesson 1 as a possible activity to use about how an empire expands. But the main point of this particular activity is what happens when it gets too big. And as a result, I tend to think that it fits a little bit better in lesson 3. So we put it in both places there, and you can look it over. And again, I've got a PowerPoint, and I'll show that in the next part. So what students do is they make a couple basic assumptions and then do some very simple calculations to see what might happen. Oh, and by the way, you will meet the next gen science standards about predictive models in this, which is actually a pretty good thing since people are talking about, oh, climate models and disease models, and mutation models and other things like that. So it gives us, if we're going to claim to be a social science, that maybe we ought to be doing some things that are just purely scientific. Again, the entire activity takes, well, I don't know, 10 or 15 minutes. And I'll show it in the next session in some detail. And then we've got a beginning of one called the Maps of the Ancient Traders. It's got a whole bunch of information cards. And again, I'll talk to that if we've got a little bit of time way at the end. The information cards have got information about a place, about what people were buying and selling there, and about the transportation connections to other places, along with a picture of what that environment looked like. It actually winds up building the Silk Road, the way the Silk Road got started. And that is from the bottom up by people traveling about 1 month in one direction and then coming back home with whatever they could buy there. So the summary is the same as usual. These activities are designed to support, not replace, the lessons you're already doing about all of these empires, about their legal systems, about their key people, about their military, about the religions that they helped spread, all of those other kinds of questions. They're designed to reinforce each other and to build on activities done in earlier grades. The people in sixth grade have an empire activity that's just like that. I'll talk about that in a minute. And they've all got different engines, different things that students are doing. Um, their main goal is to fit the topic with an approach that works for that topic. But a secondary goal is to give you some interesting things to do to add a little bit of day-to-day variety to the class. And that is one of the reasons why you can move these things around. You know, it's like the old rule of music scoring, save the trombones for when you need them. There might be a day where you just don't want to talk for a while and you want to give them a handout to play with. And again, we keep telling you, you don't have to use them all. You can start slowly, try out one or two. But remember, they are designed to support each other. And so with that, I'm going to hope that that's the end of that one, and that without too much difficulty, any luck you guys are seeing the economics of frankincense now?
We absolutely are, Phil.
Okay, thank you, thank you. How could a perfume become the most valuable commodity in international trade? Like I say, this is a PowerPoint. It's just like most of our PowerPoints. It might be a little bit too long because it's got definition cards, things like that in it, but you've got a delete key. Tree sap turns out to be an important natural resource. I'll tell you no, I won't tell you. Your students will calculate exactly how important it was. There was a tree sap that came from southern Arabia. It smelled great at a time in history. You know, students ask, well, why would you use frankincense? A really nice way to describe it is to say, well, you have two changes of clothes and you take a bath once a month, whether you need it or not. And people couldn't build great big buildings. So you're going to be in a small house or a small room with a lot of other people who take a bath once a month, whether they need it or not. In other words, frankincense had utilitarian value that goes beyond just being a sweet smell. The problem with frankincense is that it requires a very unique climate in which to grow. And that climate was in that area that we now know as Yemen. And by the way, this was a lot easier to teach 2 years ago when Yemen was in the news. If you want to see photos of the trees and more about the frankincense, there's some hot links to various websites. This tree sap became a major trade good in Roman times. But actually, it started a whole lot sooner than that. It was traded over to India and to China about 250, 300 years before the Romans heard about it. And then eventually it wound up going up to Greece and Rome. And on the way, it stopped about 2/3 of the way there at a town called Petra. Students might know something about that town because this is where a lot of the Raiders of the Lost Ark, Harrison Ford movies were filmed. And the internet site has an interactive map that shows how all kinds of empires grew, and they can just see how important Yemen was at a particular time. So the frankincense trade in Arabia had a very strategic position in a global trade network that started about 400 BC. Interestingly, that same region is the core of the modern trade network about petroleum, because that region still produces by far the most oil and ships it to Europe, to China, to Japan, and some to the United States yet. So that led me to a research question. How valuable was frankincense in Roman times compared to oil today? And you can find out on this handout page here. Now, the PowerPoint just literally goes step by step, so you don't have to give them the handout, or if you do want to reinforce some mathematics lessons, you can have them work on the handout at home and then come back and show them pictures. But basically, the handout says, well, the Roman Empire imported about 3,000 tons of frankincense in the year 25. That's pretty hard data. And the question is, how many pounds of frankincense is 3,000 tons? And it tells you 1 ton is 2,000 pounds. So you ought to be able to do the math fairly quick. And you come up with 6 million pounds of frankincense. You could do more math if you want to. A camel could carry about 400 pounds. How many camels do you need in order to move the frankincense? And so on. But we'll do the short version here. 1 pound of frankincense was worth about 6 denarii in the Roman economy. So how many denarii would it take? 36 million. Well, what's 36 million denarii? A typical Roman worker at that time earned about 12 denarii per week. That was the salary for people at the time. So how many weeks of work would it take in order to buy 36 million pounds of, and it turns out about 3 million weeks. Now you could divide that by 50, 52 if you want to be really specific, to find out how many worker years of effort would it take in order to buy all the frankincense that the Romans imported from Yemen. It turns out to be about 60,000 worker years. At that time, the Italian peninsula had a total of 2 billion workers. So you've got 60,000 out of 2 million workers, meaning frankincense was worth roughly 3% of the Roman economy at the time. Right now, the United States imports about 3.5 gigabarrels of oil every year. At $50 per barrel, that's now already obsolete. It's $70 per barrel. That adds up to about $175 billion. Let's say 200 billion, make it easy. That's less than 1% of the $20 trillion US economy right now. In other words, frankincense was 2 to 3 times as important to the Roman world as imported oil is in the United States in 2020. There's one other way to do this comparison, especially for people in Michigan, especially for people like Muskegon, that's right parked up next to the lake. There is a census of recreational boating, and you can go out to the statistical abstract of recreational boating, and you find out that spending for all boats in the United States is about $34 billion a year. That's all boats. That goes all the way from my 10-foot canoe up to Donald Trump's yacht. You take all of those, it works out to be about $34 billion a year. That's 0.2% of a $20 trillion economy of the United States. In other words, frankincense was about 15 times as important to the Roman world as all recreational boats are in the United States today. That is serious money. The moral of the story is if you want to understand what happened in the past, you have to know what the rich people of the time were willing to pay a lot of money in order to have. And that could be everything from Rolex watches to Bitcoin to Lamborghini, in today's economy. But you want to know, what did the Chinese people want to buy? What did the Persians want to buy? What did the Mayans want to buy? What did the Shanghai people want? You want to know what the rich people of the time were willing to pay a lot of money, because that's what's going to drive a lot of their military activity. And at the time of the Romans, that was frankincense. One of the reasons the Romans had something like 5 legions in places like Israel and Lebanon and Syria and Egypt. So that's one activity. And with some luck, this PowerPoint, interestingly enough, is not designed for you guys at all. This PowerPoint was actually designed by the 6th grade giants to give to the 6th grade students who have a glick about learning where empires were in the past. And this PowerPoint is for you to use if they didn't do that back then. Now, it sets up an activity that is similar to your activity, but not identical, because your activity uses the names of the ancient empires as the key, and students have to remember some of the facts about those empires. The 6th grade activity cheats a little bit, and it says the Han Dynasty was important in East Asia. Which of these maps was the Han Dynasty? In other words, the 6th grade activity was basically about learning the names of the continents and the subregions within the continents. So the standards that I listed at the beginning are about the characteristics of conflict and cooperation in different regions. And the specific questions are, what continent or subcontinent was each of these old empires inside? And how big did it get? And did any of them want the same area that another empire controlled, and therefore they're likely to fight over it? So you could review these region names if you need to in 7th grade, or delete this frame here. I suspect some of your students are going to need to have a little hint as to what the difference is between South Asia, East Asia, Central Asia, Southwest Asia. Southwest Asia is also called the Middle East, or in the geohistogram, we just call it the middle, because it is very close to the middle of the land area of the world. Your handout has a packet with a table of a whole lot of these empires. We're focusing on the Big Eight. And the Big Eight activity is just to match each empire with a map that shows the area where it started, then name at least one modern country that's in that area. Now, this is the sixth grade version, so it says Persian Empire and then Southwest Asia. And then they look around for something that's in Southwest Asia and decide, oh yeah, that must be place number 8. The PowerPoint actually shows them, you can talk about it, and then it gives you the answers. The real question, of course, are what are the modern countries that are likely to have legacies left over? And that's where your 7th grade class takes over from this activity. And it tries to identify what's going on in those particular areas that can be traced all the way back to when the Islamic caliphates ruled that area or when the Mongols ruled that area. So, were these empires separate? Were they connected by trade? Was there conflict between them? Like I say, the 6th grade one leads you through. That one is an empire that is predominantly in Europe with a little bit in Africa, and the other one is predominantly in East Asia. What two powerful empires existed in those regions at the same time? And that's the Roman and the Han empires. What trade route connected them? The Silk Road. What are the names of these empires? You can see this is just a kind of a step-by-step through it. What continent are they both inside? Did they ever talk to each other? Probably not, because they've got really high mountains in between them. And therefore, there was very little cultural contact until they got ships that were good enough to make the maritime Silk Road work. Then it says the blue empire is in what continent? South Asia. The other one is in which 3 continents? Mark a place that both of them tried to control. And if you identify that, you find out that Afghanistan was controlled by both the Persian and the Mauryan empires at somewhat different times. Is that part of its current history? Probably. Especially when you take a look at 2 more empires that were especially large, the Islamic and Mongol empires, and find out that they also both controlled Afghanistan at different times. In other words, Afghanistan has got about a 2,000-year history of resisting foreign empires trying to take over their territory. It's no wonder that the hand of both the Russians and the United States, they're much. Now, it goes on to ask about continents that they did not try to control. Now that you've got a rough idea of these areas, you can start to discuss a more important question. What present-day characteristics are the results of these ancient empires? Like I say, that's the 2 short activities. Now it's kind of up to you, Dave. Do you want me to do the reasons for the fall of Rome in the next 7 or 8 minutes, or do we want to take the break earlier? Or does Becky have an 8-minute block that she wanted to talk about now?
I'm not certain Becky's block was 8.5 minutes, but we can definitely kick it over to her for anything she does have for skills and stuff, and then we can take the break early. And if we stay on agenda, that helps me remember what I'm doing at the right time. So,
okay. Well, so you de-shared me. I don't have a button here again. Yeah, you have. Okay.
I can de-share you while, which is a great new term, by the way. I'm going to use that in every future Zoom, but I can de-share you
There's my
while we
button.
go over to
Just came
Becky.
back.
There you go. All right. Over to Becky for skills and stuff.
This definitely falls under the stuff category. But, you know, we were talking earlier about spec as a way to help students organize their thinking. I think another way, especially to keep them from getting too bogged down in the minutia, and it really lends itself to a lot of the conditions and connections that we often talk about in geography. 4 questions that when I'm teaching about historical events, I limit it to these 4 questions. What happened? What were they thinking? Why then and there? And what do we think about that? And if I hold myself to those, my kids do okay. They don't get too bogged down in minutia. I don't require them to get too bogged down in minutia. They consider the role that geography is playing, and it makes it fairly easy for them to work with historical thinking skills in order to answer those questions. That's all I've got.
All right. Well, Anthony threw in the chat, what, no jingle for skills and stuff? And my response, if you missed what I put in the chat, was no, she really hated that jingle. So we'll try again in the new year. 2022 is a new year, and we'll be back for Unit 5 then. But right now, I think we are going to go ahead and take a break. And we will come back at 5:55 and we will continue on through the agenda. So go ahead and take a break and we'll see you back here at 5:55. All right, well, it has been 15 minutes. So I am going to welcome us back from our big break, and we're going to move into Unit 2. There's actually going to be some group participation in this next part. After I sort of go through the overview of Lesson 2 and spotlight a focused inquiry and talk a little bit about what a focused inquiry is, we're actually going to have you guys undertake the bento box portion of this. So just FYI, some breakout rooms are coming up here in just a few minutes before we then move into Lesson 3 and then talk a little bit about assessment and then hopefully let you guys go a little bit early tonight. So that's kind of the roadmap for where we're going next. And I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. There we go. All right. So as far as, did I really close Safari? Really? I did? Oh, great. Good job, Johnson. So as far as Unit 2 or Lesson 2 of Unit 4 goes, this one we tackle inventions and geography and how those impact the development of empires. So our supporting question for Lesson 2 is just that: how do inventions and geography impact the development of empires? You can see again the content expectations that we're really getting into for this lesson are 314, 315, basically 314 on. We really hit the first 3.1 standards with the first lesson, although we do circle back to them again in a later unit, as I mentioned before. You can also see, so Becky had the presentation on GSpec, on spec a little bit earlier, and that wasn't just a random one-off. That was here for a reason, because we are actually introducing GSpec in this lesson. So that's a good little piece for you to review, because there's something to do with it in this particular lesson. Phil and I talked a lot as we were developing the lessons, the whole grade level. We were talking a lot about the role that slavery played in the ancient world. So if it feels like in some of the earlier units we hit slavery a lot, and that we're going to hit slavery a lot here, and then we hit slavery again in later units, it's because it was a significant portion of the ancient world, and it doesn't seem to matter what area of the world you zoom in on. Places that both had contact with other parts of the world and didn't have contact with other parts of the world seem to develop this institution of slavery. So we come back around to it in this lesson as well with a overview presentation on slavery and empires. I had a lot of fun. Another one of my very Spartan PowerPoints. It's not as pretty as the ones that Dr. Gershwell put together, but I had a lot of fun developing the ancient weaponry presentation. And believe it or not, Dr. Gershwell and I had a lot of conversation about things that made the cut in this and things that didn't make the cut and why. And then, of course, we broke out chariots. We both found chariots in particular pretty fascinating. So we broke that out with extra reading, which would be a great thing to apply something like the talk to the text strategy that I outlined at the last rollout. That's an option for you here as well. Um, but where I'm going to zoom in here for a few minutes, and this is where the group participation will come in just a sec, is we include a focused inquiry in this unit. And as far as what a focused inquiry is and what that means, I'm going to go to a very brief, somewhat less Spartan, but still pretty Spartan PowerPoint that sort of goes over what a focused inquiry is. Now, I brought up Kevin earlier. Kevin is in my book study on blueprinting and inquiry-based curriculum that I've been doing this fall via Flipgrid up in my zone. And focused inquiry is one of the types of inquiry that are outlined in that book. So for those of you who don't know who Kathy Swan, S.G. Grant, and John Lee are, they're kind of the lead writers of the C3 framework, which is part of our standards. That was a document created at the national level a few years back with the help and support of the National Council for Social Studies, as well as CCSSO, that was heavily involved in the development of the Common Core state standards and the Next Gen Science standards. So it's kind of our version of that, and it is included in our state standards document as well. And they have some really good books out on how to blueprint an inquiry. But my favorite of their books is the most recent one, which is Blueprinting an Inquiry-Based Curriculum, because it takes what they've done in their earlier work and gives you a whole bunch of different, they call them flavors, a whole bunch of different flavors of inquiry. And one of those flavors is a focused inquiry. And I really, really like that. So I use the word IDM to mean inquiry design model, and we use a modified IDM template for Giants. They haven't really, by they I mean Swan, Grant, and Lee haven't really done a lot of work on unit planning inquiry. So this is, theoretical stuff that Becky and I sort of threw together a long time ago when we were first moving authors down, when we were first moving Giants writers down the path of developing units. So we took that overall IDM style template and we sort of adapted it to a unit level need. So it looks very different, but it is designed, as you've probably noticed, to facilitate a conversation on unit long inquiry and making sure that you're practicing little components of that throughout. This is what a standard IDM template looks like if you visit C3 teachers. We've even included a couple in 7th grade and other Giants grade levels as well. Where things start to become different, we start off the same. We've got our compelling question at the top and we've got our state standards in here. But where things get a little bit different on a standard IDM are the columns in the center with your supporting questions and the formative performance tasks and the featured sources. And when you take a look at one of these, whether it's from the C3 framework or c3teachers.org, or whether it's from the Michigan Inquiry Hub that'll be popping up on misocialstudies.org this year, or insert name of place to go to get inquiries here. Typically an IDM like this Might take a week, might take a week and a half. In some cases, it might take 2 weeks, but so a standard IDM is really a couple of weeks worth of, or a week to 2 weeks worth of time. And giants, we do, like I said before, we do include some C3 style inquiries in giants, but we've sort of adapted our own framework. And in Unit 4, I included a small focused inquiry, which is a different type of IDM blueprint altogether. A focused inquiry really approaches things from a, okay, we're not going to do this full scale 2 week IDM inquiry on this one topic. We're going to do a much smaller focused inquiry on one small component of this topic. It's an opportunity to help build that inquiry muscles, what I like to say with my teacher groups, because it's not just, it's not walking kids through 8 different sources per supporting question. It's great for teachers who are feeling a time crunch, which who isn't? I mean, we were feeling the time crunch pre-pandemic, and now we're still in the pandemic. And we're every single day. If I hear anything from teachers, it's, "Dear God, I'm losing time, and I don't know how to get it back." So, a focused inquiry can be a method for you to really do that, to move through, to move through a small chunk of your content. Um, and really, this is where sources become key. In a regular IDM, you may end up having, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, all the way up to, I've seen, inquiries with 3 supporting questions that have, anywhere between 5 and 10 different sources that kids are going to look at under each supporting question. Usually with a focused inquiry, you're just looking at 2 or 3. Which I like, because again, you're just taking a small chunk of that content. The focus on a focused inquiry is on marrying the, and I got to get my drink handy. Becky, you want to get yours because I'm going to say it this time. It's an opportunity to marry content with the skill and really, yep, gotta drink when we say that, but it's also a way to really hone in on a specific skill in a focused inquiry format. So I like it. So we include a small focused inquiry in this unit in lesson 2, is the US an empire? And I don't actually give you an IDM template for this, although there's a much longer version of this on the C3 Teachers website. I don't know why my kid's school is calling, but it better not be because school is not canceled tomorrow. Or because okay. So yes, so we have this IDM template up. We do not have an IDM template for this up, but there is a full scale inquiry on this that you can take from C3 Teachers. I can give you the link later if you're interested in it. But what we've done is I've taken that one and condensed it into a focused inquiry. So the sources are short. They're designed to be just part of our coverage of this topic of, is the US an empire? We actually get into this more in lesson 3. We get into it in unit 6 as well. We're not done with this, but taking some time out to do a focused inquiry and practice this one skill that I'm going to highlight in just a minute is a good opportunity to build in some of that time to have much deeper conversations with it later. Whether you choose to do a Socratic circle or have a debate or have them actually write the paper is up to you, but you're not going to do any of that with the activities that we have you, with the path that we're taking you down in this unit. So the skill that we're practicing here is actually going to be creating a bento box, a history bento box. Some of you may know what a bento box is. There's a picture of it on this slide. I lived in Japan for a year, and these were not a thing to the best of my knowledge when I was there in the late 90s. But they are definitely a thing now. And if they were a thing, I just missed it because I was the American that was always looking for the fast food joint. So it's quite possible they were there and I missed it. But a bento box, basically the way I like to explain it, some Japanese parents with way too much time on their hands like to make these like fun little lunch boxes for their kids where everything has its own little component and it has its own little part. And you can see Hello Kitty down in the bottom there, made out of rice. So you've got a rice ball with some extra things on it to resemble Hello Kitty. And they're cute and they're fun. But I read, and this is linked in the unit plan, I read a great article from Middle Level Learners, which is the digital only middle school publication that the National Council for Social Studies puts out, that kind of outlined. And again, I stole a PDF copy of this um, and linked it into the what am I trying to say here? I linked it into the lesson plan template so you guys can read the whole article if you want to. I took a slightly different approach than they did in that article because I wanted to practice a specific skill of developing a claim and supporting it with evidence. Not writing the paper, just getting that claim out and finding two pieces of evidence that support it. So that's the skill that we're going to focus in on for this focused inquiry. And so another thing I really like about this is we are, as I mentioned before, into snow day season. And this allows you to both catch up, do a short activity that gives you some bang for your buck for future activities later on down the route line. Hopefully this will not be like 4 winters ago where I think we all had like 27 snow days. You know, we missed the month of October in snow days between December and March. That's not a year I want to live through again, but as we have these snow days pop up over the next few weeks, over the next couple of months, I should say, this bento box idea with this focused inquiry gives your kids some background ammunition that they can then go ahead and turn around and use later, whether it's at the end of this unit or in Unit 6 when we're more into the collapse of empires and we revisit this idea of, is the United States an empire? So you can see, and in the Giants lesson plan, I've linked you out to a one slide template that's set up very much like the assessments have been, in that the background is not editable unless they go in and actually edit the slide master, but then it has a box for them to type your claim here. Oops. And I totally just deleted a slide. You've got type your claim here, type your supporting evidence piece 1 here, type your supporting evidence piece 2 here. If you are getting into counterclaims and rebuttals, we've got those boxes, but you can also, if that's like beyond where your kids are right now, the important part are these 3 boxes of this bento box, and these can be the extra credit piece that you push kids toward. It's all in where your kids are. And if you've ever tried to teach counterclaim and rebuttal to your students, you know that it is occasionally difficult. So, go there if you're ready for it, or use it as a good teaching moment. But this is available in the Giants lesson plan for kids, and it automatically forces a copy for them to create their own bento box using the sources that we provide. So what I'm going to have you guys do, and you can access the sources in a couple of different ways. But what I'm going to have you guys do is I've created a Jamboard that I'm going to go in and find again in just a minute because I made the mistake of closing my Safari tabs. That was not a smart move on my part. But you can either open up the source packs from the Giants lesson plan, or I've put 3 sticky notes on each slide of the Jamboard. And I'm going to give you guys 15 minutes. It's not a lot of time. You may or may not finish, but I'm going to divide you randomly into groups of 2. And you will have 15 minutes with your partner to kind of go through the source packs and build your bento box in the Jamboard that I will resurrect here and throw into the chat and send out as an announcement in just a second. So while I'm finding this, again, you can access the source packs from the document itself or from the Jamboard that I'm going to bring up in just a minute. And if you are in group 1, you will be Jamboard slide 1. If you're in group 2, you'll be Jamboard slide 2, etc. While I'm pulling this up, what questions might you have for me? Here we go. Okay, hearing none, you can also ask questions via the chat or send me a message and I will help you as we go through that. But hearing none, I'm going to break you into groups. And remember, if you're in group 1, you'll be working on Jamboard slide 1. And you should just be able to click and go. If you're in group 2, you'll be working on Jamboard slide 2 and so on. And the reason we're having you do this is because now at the end of the night tonight, you will all have an example of a put together bento box that you can share with your students, both for teaching purposes or, just as that solid example. And you will have been through what we're going to ask them to do to build it. So that should make you experts on the bento box process going forward. So I'm throwing a link to it in the chat right now. I'm going to open breakout rooms and send you in there. We will be back in 15 minutes, which will be 6:26 roughly by the time I stop talking. And if you have questions, flag us down. And you don't have to finish if you don't make it that far, because we're not giving you a super long period of time to do this. So I'm going to open breakout rooms. We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 participants. We've got 9 minus 3, 6. So I'm going to make 3 breakout rooms. Three breakout rooms. Create. And I'm going to send you all. I'm going to have Phil and Becky can stay here. Everyone else should be in a room with one other person, and we'll see you back here in 15 minutes. All right, welcome back, everybody. Appreciate you. At 6:30 on a Wednesday night after a long day. Appreciate you all going into breakout rooms and having this conversation for an impossible 15 minutes because I really like this activity and I like, in snooping on your slides, I like where the groups have gone with this. You also now have several good examples you can share with your students either before or after going through this. But in looking at group one, they did get their claim out in comparison to the Roman Republic or Empire. The United States is not an empire. And they were able to get their 2 pieces of evidence in here. The Roman Republic had one body of government, whereas the US has a bicameral legislature, and the United States allows all citizens to vote and almost all people living here pathway to vote. And I think I know where that sentence was going to go if they'd probably had even 35 to 40 more seconds. So nicely done, group one. Oh, wait, they even got into, okay, bonus points, group one, bonus points for going into the counterclaim rebuttal phase of things, the extra credit part of the bento box, the rice ball Hello Kitty, if you will. An argument could be made that some positions are made for life, like Rome. Those positions vary and are created by the Constitution. What you guys have done with this, and what all the other groups have done with this, is the hard work of actually crafting out what a paper answering that compelling question is the United States an empire. That you've actually done the hard work of crafting the outline for that paper. This could be something that could then get turned into a full paper, and you've got your outline here. And this is going to come back in the assessment for this unit as well. We have an opportunity to build a bento box as part of the assessment for the unit. But this is really great pre-writing strategy. If I pull up group 2, they were able to get their claim out. They had some notes going. The United States is not an empire. Empire, not umpire. We're neither, apparently. We are not an empire. We're on left of the Roman Republic, not the empire. Our 3 branches have. So yes, all the groups were able to get something out in their bento box in the impossible amount of time that you have here, and you now have some solid examples that you can share with kids as you ask them to build their own bento boxes using evidence from the 3 source packs. So appreciate your time and effort on that. I also appreciate that you humored us and went into breakout rooms and had some small conversations about 3 source packs to try to build this. So do any of you have any questions over this activity, the focused inquiry in general, or what we just had you do? I'm on my second of 3 breaths. And that's my third breath. So Again, appreciate this, and we are ready for the next portion of the agenda. And I still have not actually been able to bring that tab back up. So, oh, there it is. Giants rollout agendas. There we go. All right, so with me being done on lesson 2, we've got if Becky wants to add anything under the skills and stuff category, she is free to do so here. Otherwise, we're then going to move into Phil's going to close us out with the lesson 3 pieces on decline of empires. So, Becky, anything for skills and stuff you want to add here?
Not right now. Let's go to Phil.
All right, then without further ado, we go back to the prime rib of the evening, Dr. Gershmal. Phil, it's all you.
So you see the screen?
We do, in fact, see the screen, yes.
And if I click on there, we get 50 reasons for the fall of the Roman Empire. I found it kind of interesting to read what people had written in the bento box. You could actually think of this activity as a 10 slot bento box with where you don't get to take the first question, you just get to think about the supporting evidence. I wanted to bring up one thing about technical definitions here. If the difference between a civilization or a culture and an empire is that an empire captures other peoples and incorporates them into your territory, then by that definition, the United States is a very strange empire because we did capture some and kept them, but we also captured others and gave them back. So we one time ruled over the Philippines or Cuba or places like that. Now, that's one of the things that comes up when we talk about the fall of the Roman Empire. I'm leaving the title up here for a while because this is another one of these activities that you could use at the beginning of talking about the Roman Empire or somewhere in the middle to talk about what's actually happening here, or as a summary at the end in order to raise the question of is the United States an empire like Rome was? Because the simple fact is that a lot of people talk about the Roman Empire. In the last political campaign, I did not spend a lot of time paying attention to commercials and debates and things like that. I mean, I just behaved like a normal citizen and maybe watched an hour and a half or 2 hours of that over the course of the campaign. But no fewer than 6 different candidates talked about the Roman Empire. And they would cite things about the Roman Empire. So, with that as a little bit of background, I would use this near the beginning of my discussion of empires just to talk a little bit about the uses of history and why we spend so much time studying the Roman Empire. So, with that, the Roman Empire was arguably the strongest military force in the world in the year 100. And a lot of textbooks spend a whole lot of time talking about the phalanx and about the legions and about the military organization and a whole lot of stuff like that. I think kids will read about that all by themselves, and we don't need to talk about it too much. It's just sort of inherently interesting for some kids, and others find it a crashing bore. In any case, I've watched too many people spend too much time on that particular part of it. The Roman buildings were spectacular. Roman inventions were spectacular. Some of them have lasted for thousands of years, even though they were built at a time when many people in the world lived in tents or log huts. And even though they were built in a place that is prone to a lot of earthquakes, the buildings are still standing. A real tribute to construction abilities. And then a couple hundred years later, people who lived in log huts and tents invaded the Roman Empire Rome's population went down from 1 million to less than 30,000 people. And those 30,000 people must have had a whole lot of fun because they could live in all those old houses. In any case, the question comes up, why did Rome fall if it was so powerful and all that? And a whole lot of historians have tried to answer that question. Meanwhile, as I said at the beginning, politicians and preachers today keep pointing to conditions in present day America and say, oh, we've got high taxes just like Rome did, and that's one of the reasons that Rome fell. Or we've got corrupt movies, and that was one of the things about the Roman Empire is they had all these orgies and things like that, and that's why they fell. Or we don't treat our anyway. The implication is that we should learn a lesson from history. And like I say, 7 politicians mentioned that. So let's take a look at some of the reasons that some historians say led to the fall of Rome. On the bottom of this handout are 4 sources for some of these lists. But the fact is, credible historians have suggested more than 200 different conditions about the Roman Empire that contributed to the fall. So let's see how many of these might apply to present day America. Thought experiment number 1. Imagine that you've been hired by some conservative politicians who believe that big government, high taxes, government spending, and public debt are real problems. Does that sound like anybody you've heard of today? If you went through that list, what 5 or 10 reasons would you list? And I say 5 or 10, but it could be any number in between. If you want the activity to go fast, tell them to look for 4 reasons. If you want to spend a little bit more time thinking about critical thinking, then have them look for a dozen reasons. The idea is, could you find a credible historian that said Rome fell because the taxes just got to be so burdensome that they wound up crippling the economy? Thought experiment number 2, you get the idea here now. You've been hired by some liberal politicians who think that the government's job is to offer childcare, education, anti-poverty, programs to help needy people. What reasons on the list might support the idea that Rome fell because it failed to provide an adequate safety net? And eventually the citizens just kind of gave up and moved out to the country and said, I'm out of here. I'm not interested in this anymore. Thought experiment number 3. You've been hired by a preacher or a moral political leader who think that people are wasting too much time and money in gambling, drugs, alcohol, other immoral behavior. Are there any lists on this? Or imagine a different kind of politician. Describe the person's ideas and then look at the list and see if you could come up with a list. You might even ask what kind of government you'd design in order to avoid the kinds of problems that you think led to the fall of Rome. The bottom line is the fall of Rome was a very long and complex process. Historians have suggested more than 200 different conditions that may have aided the collapse of the Roman civilization. And if you use this activity at the beginning of talking about Rome, and then saying, as we explore further into how Rome changed from being a republic into becoming an empire, as we look at how different emperors wound up passing the torch on to their children, if you look how some really corrupt people wound up being emperor, you could use this at the beginning to kind of prime them for what they should pay attention to. Or you can use it at the end just to ask the question, do we really know how and why it fell? Because the bottom line is you should be suspicious of anybody who claims to have a simple list of the 10 reasons why Rome fell. And now if you want to do something later on tonight, go out to Google and put in 10 reasons for the fall of Rome and see who all is saying that kind of thing and how different their lists are. Because the fall of Rome was a long and complicated process. Now, we've tried this activity out in inner city Detroit and in rural areas. And depending on how it's set up, this can be one of the high points of the students discussing. They can really get into it because the fall of Rome was a long and very complicated process. So that's one activity. And then related to that, because what I think is kind of interesting is that only a couple of historians mention what I, as a geographer, would think is one of the most important reasons. And that is the simple geographical geometry of an empire of any kind. And so there's a PowerPoint and an activity that talks about that. And it's talking about constructing a predictive model. And in doing so, it's constructing a model, it's meeting one of the next gen science standards because it lets you, as a social scientist, talk a little bit about interdisciplinary things. So, with that, there is a PowerPoint that goes along with it. This is an activity that you can do in a number of different ways. You can either run the PowerPoint, or you can run PowerPoint partly to set it up, or you can just describe it orally to them. Imagine that a country started in the northwest corner of a large continent. Now we've turned this continent into a whole bunch of squares because it meets several educational standards, including these next generation science standards. It talks about the development of empires. It talks about a reason for the collapse of empires. It talks about arguments about conflict and cooperation. And it has this useful link to STEM because we're basically developing a very simple predictive model. So what is a predictive model? It is a set of assumptions that can be translated into a math equation. Now, I'll tell you that the math in here is extremely simple because one of the purposes of doing this is to help convince the people who are the most math phobic that math is actually kind of useful and it doesn't have to be real complicated. A computer could run the model if you wanted to make it complicated. In fact, if you've got a couple hotshot wannabe programmers in your crowd, you might actually tell them to write a computer program to do this. Now, what does this mean? I'm going to just build one to find out. I'm not going to talk about it right now. What kind of model? How about a model of how an empire grows and why it might fall? That might even help us understand what's happening in the world today, like what's going on in the Ukraine or in Taiwan or someplace like that. A predictive model starts with some assumptions. And this particular predictive model has very simple assumptions. Number one is that we describe the world as a bunch of identical squares. Incidentally, the climate model that we use to predict global warming divides the world up into 6,200 squares. That is just about as many squares as a supercomputer can handle in a couple hours. Our model is a whole lot simpler. It's got 7 by 7, 50 squares total. Assumption number two is that if the empire captures another square, it gains 5 units of loot. In other words, it basically steals the life savings of the people that were there, maybe steal some of their children as slaves too. And every empire in history has done exactly that. They take over a piece of territory and they very often enslave part of the population when they do that. Assumption number three It costs 2 units of loot to pay for the soldiers to capture each square. You've got to pay for the troops, the weapons, the supplies, transportation. You got to do exactly what the Russians are doing right now as they're massing tanks on the border of Ukraine. And then finally, it costs 1 unit of loot to rule each old square, to pay for the government, the police, the roads, the schools in the land that you already have. That's it. 4 very simple assumptions. Let's see how it works. And I've got a data table over here. It's going to wind up with a lot of numbers, but each one of these numbers is just ridiculously easy. That's the whole purpose of a predictive model, to do something very simple mathematically in order to answer a very complicated question about a complicated system. So for time period 1, this empire sends armies and captures every square that's right next to it. That means an empire of 1 square captures 3 more squares. So we write down how much area did it capture. Now, how much loot did it gain when it did that? Well, the assumption is it gets 5 units, so 5 times 3 is 15. How much loot will it cost? Well, it costs 2 units for each square, so 2 times 3, that's 6. And how much does it cost to rule what we already have? Well, we only had 1 square, it costs 1, that's 1. So we can think about what's the profit of expanding as an empire. And the answer, you start out with 15 because you captured that much. It costs you 6 to do it and 1 to rule. You've got 8 left over. That's a bunch of profit. And literally dozens of people in history have decided that it's better to steal stuff from your neighbors and make them part of your empire than it is to. Now, is the United States an empire? Did we steal adjacent land from other people that lived there as we expanded? Not exactly a rhetorical question, is it? It's a historical fact. Time period 2. We capture another ring of squares. Now there's 5 new squares, which means we're going to make 25 units of loot, which means it's going to cost us 10 to do it. But we're going to have ruled 4 old squares. And when we calculate that out, the profit turns out to be 11. In other words, the empire is expanding. We've gotten a whole bunch of new slaves and soldiers, and now we've got enough power to expand even farther. Time period 3. We go out and capture another ring of squares. Now there's 7 of them. And here are the numbers for this time period. Check to make sure they make sense. And again, you could have stopped this presentation 1 step ago and told the students to go off in small groups and do the rest of the calculations, and then we'll check them here. In other words, it all depends on what other math activity what other math objectives you want to help the students meet in your curriculum. And it puts the assumptions down so that if you did do that, then you come back to this thing, we've got all assumptions back up on the screen for them, so you can remind them of that. Time period 4, we captured 9 new squares. And we gained about that much, which means our profit was now that much. And you notice something that's happened here. Well, let's see. Let's try time period 5. Now we got 11 new squares, which means we make 55, and it costs us 22. And now we're down to 8. And then we ask one more, time period number 6. How much loot is gained? And now if you look at the last column, look what's happened here. Now, this is, in fact, the Roman Empire about the time of Christ, or very shortly thereafter. They had stretched about as far east as they could go. First of all, they had to run into the Persians, who were pretty strong farther east. And secondly, they had outfits like the Maccabees and so on that were resisting, that were starting to make it more difficult to govern. And what you see on the screen here happened to every empire except the Mongols. They are the exception to the rule because they didn't have a center. The Mongols were where the Mongols were. And because they did not have a central location that would rule over, it had to send troops out to the frontier, it had to pay for the transportation, it had to pay for the troops, and so on. The Mongols were able to build a bigger empire, but it never really was an empire. All the others, the Han Dynasty, the Songhai in West Africa, uh, the Hopewell in the United States, the, uh, the Persian empires, all of these other empires got up to a certain size and just found that they had stretched themselves too thin. And it just was no longer possible to keep control over all that territory. It's kind of the inexorable logic of empires if you look at them from a geographic point of view. Now, the question is that an accurate model? Is that really what happened? Do we have historic cases of when an empire stretched out a little bit too far and it just couldn't support the troops out that far, it couldn't pay for the transportation, it couldn't keep the supplies going out there, it just couldn't control what was going on that far away? Does that apply? And I'll leave it at that. The two big questions: what will happen in the next time period if it tries to capture more land? And what will happen if they stop invading land and therefore they're not making up all the new loot? In other words, if they stop invading, then they have no income at all from out there. Now you've got to rely on your own ability to produce. And what do you think they can do about this? So this is what the model tells us. If an empire depends on captured land, captured slaves, captured money, captured property to support its armies and its economy, then inevitably costs are going to grow to become more than gains, and the empire is going to be in trouble. They have to figure out how to increase income, which of course led the Roman Empire to increase taxes later on, or they've got to figure out how to reduce their cost, which led the Roman Empire to conscript soldiers from other places out in the fringes and not to have, they went away from a volunteer Roman army to a drafted foreign army, or figure out some other way to reduce their cost. You see how a simple model like this might help people to understand problems that are caused by a complicated thing like the growth of an empire. And then you can look at that map of the empires in the past. Remember the one that we were matching? And look at how many of them got up to be about the same size. Or better yet, go out to that website that was cited on the frankincense thing about the spread of empires, because that shows the extent of a lot more empires, and see how they went. And you might even ask them, how could you improve this model? Because the Mauryan Empire never got as big as it could have. And it didn't get as big because it ran into environments where its army just didn't work anymore. Its army was based on war elephants and chariots, and neither one of those is going to work very well when you go up into the mountains. So with that, is the United States an empire? Have we extended out too far? For more than 100 years, we captured land and used it to pay for the things we wanted. We gave grants of land in the frontier to pay for the soldiers in the Revolutionary War. In other words, we stole land from Indians and gave it to the soldiers. We gave land to the states to build the schools and the universities, the Morrill Land Grant Act and the Homestead Act. We gave grants of land near the frontier to Civil War soldiers and their families in order to pay for them. We gave land in all Western states to encourage people to move from Europe. We gave land after we stole it from somebody to the railroads in order to build the railroads across the country. And now there are some politicians who want to sell some national parks and wilderness areas in order to help pay for the federal debt. Think about it for a little while. How much of the present day American economy was basically paid for by giving away land to selected groups of people, railroads, homesteaders, soldiers. The dark green areas of this map, by the way, show where the US government gave millions of square miles of land to the railroad companies. That's one of the reasons why Warren Buffett is so rich, because he happens to control a whole bunch of that land up in Montana. And then what happens to an empire when there is no new land to capture and to use and to sell to pay for what you want? That's about when the United States started running a national debt. So that puts me a few minutes ahead of time. If there are any questions.
Bill, we did have one question come in through the chat. Sarah asked, are these later slides in it new? And I told her I think so because we've done some additional edits to this unit recently. But if those slides are new, and they're not the ones that are linked, I'll need you to get those to me so I can put it up, unless it's the one you sent me today.
Yeah, I don't think that one has been changed, but I
Okay.
do know a couple others were. So I will indeed update all of the material that I've got for this unit 4 within the next day or so. Like I say, my last month was basically dropped into K2 with almost no time for anything else.
All right.
And the summary PowerPoint that I showed you at the beginning was finished at 2:46 this afternoon, which I
We're always
believe
just ahead of the sheriff.
which I believe is being about a couple hours ahead of the sheriff.
Yep. All right, so that's a good reminder for all of you too. If something isn't in what's linked in the units that you remember distinctly seeing here, contact me because it gets hard to keep all of the emails from Dr. Gershmel straight sometimes. So sometimes he forgets to send them to me, and sometimes I miss something that needs to get relinked. So yeah, if this doesn't end up being the one that's linked, just let us know and we'll get it figured out.
And let me also say just an invitation that we will put up the information for that Silk Road game sometime in the next week. If people want to just look at it on their own, like I say, that is a very early beta test type game. And if you want to play around with it for a little while and make some suggestions, that would definitely be welcome. This particular activity that I just showed you benefited greatly from suggestions that I was able to do in Detroit and in Dearborn with a bunch of teachers in a workshop 2 years ago. So if you want to be in at the ground floor, take a look at that Silk Road Traders thing when it finally makes it up, which will probably be about Saturday this week.
Well, are there any other questions for Phil before we pass the torch over to Becky for a moment? Hearing none, it's time for Skills and Stuff with Becky Bush. Good times.
Thanks, Dave. I am going to share my screen because I just want to introduce one train of thought. Let's see. Okay.
You should be able to steal control from Phil. There you go. Yep.
Yeah. We haven't really talked about this in detail during this network. But again, I would just ask that maybe we can think about this and revisit this and have a discussion at a later time. But when Phil's going through a lot of lesson 3, I keep thinking back to these themes because it is so pertinent. And I'm not suggesting that we don't teach ancient world history in chronological order. I think we have to for 7th grade students to be able to make sense of things. But what I do think is that we can also, while we're teaching chronologically, I think we can also teach thematically. I think that there are 6 universal themes of history, and it doesn't matter if we're teaching US history or if we're teaching world history. But the more we can help our students think about events, situations, things like empires, the more they will move away from the rote regurgitation of facts. I used to call it the meanwhile back at the ranch syndrome, right? In that often when things are happening, particularly in world history, in one particular place, students have a hard time coming up with what else is going on elsewhere. And so I think that these themes can really help students understand, first of all, that there are a lot of enduring issues that continue to come up in our nation's history and throughout the history of the world over time. And I think it also helps students understand and really integrate both spatial types of thinking as well as temporal thinking. So, thinking about particular issues like conflict, for example, across time as well as across space. Now, obviously, when we're talking about empires, we're talking much more about spatial situations and spatial developments. But I think that, again, bringing it back to some of those themes at whichever point in time is the most relevant, I think it can really help students understand that there are a lot of enduring issues that maybe they don't think of as enduring issues. So these posters Dave and I put together when we were doing past, right, Dave?
I believe it was past. Maybe it was open book, although that looks like the past green. So it was probably past.
I think so too. And we did not come up with these themes. These themes have been around
Yes, we did. They are 100% original, and by using them, you have to pay us a small copyright.
Thanks. I like where you're going with that, Dave. But again, we will put these in the folder with everything else. But again, potentially give it some thought. I'd like to have a discussion next time. I can share some of the things that I did when I was in the classroom with regard to these 6 themes, and some direct examples of how students benefited. So again, I don't want to take a lot of time because we need to wrap things up, but they will be in the folder.
All right, so for those of you keeping score, the themes of history are another thing to take a drink of whatever's handy whenever Becky brings them up. That's another thing that we've developed in the social studies world that is a thing. So if she does bring up themes of history again, make sure you always have a beverage nearby for that and the skills and content piece. So. All right, I'm going to wrest control of the screen from Becky, and I'm going to kind of close this off tonight. I did promise you a slightly earlier out, and we are definitely on track for that. We spent more time on the assessment part of it in earlier sessions, but you're either using them or you're not. And, at this point, an assessment's an assessment. So for Unit 4, this time around, we have a 25-question assessment. Complete with rubric. Now, Becky and I have 2 very differing views on rubrics, but I did finally task her with, okay, Miss Rubric Lady, go ahead and build one for this question then. So we have a rubric for one of the test questions, but I'm going to really quickly go in order just to kind of show you the scope of this, and then we'll take any last minute questions and probably be done about 15 minutes early tonight. So, that's our holiday gift to you from Dave, Becky, and Phil, the elves on the shelves. So, this first one, and again, we like to have some activator questions, but use this map in your knowledge of ancient history to make a generalization about the role of geography on the development of empires. This is not their opportunity to write a 5 or 6 paragraph essay, as the case may be. This is just make some generalizations. And this is a really good diagnostic question for some of the ones that follow. So if they get like 2, 3, and 4 wrong, you can go back to their initial generalization and kind of see what was, where things may have gone wrong. The second and third questions, we've got to select all that apply style question. We do like to mirror the types of questions that they'll see on the M-STEP, not because the M-STEP is a great assessment. It's terrible. It's crap. Don't waste your time disseminating the information. But we can, and yes, that part was recorded. So feel free to play back. I guess this would be the 2-hour mark, roughly. Don't be bashful. You can play it back for your principal, but you meet anyone in Becky and Mai's line of work, and it's a terrible assessment that we shouldn't even waste time, trying to find something useful for. But we do, to help you out, try to model some of the questions that they'll see there, and select all that apply questions are one of those item types that MDE has moved towards using. So with this one, you've got to select all that apply, and then another question on generalizations. What generalization can be made regarding the relationship between geographic characteristics and the development of these early empires? We then move into another one of our drag and drop style questions, where they'll take each of these markers and they'll drag it either into, this was a characteristic of an empire, this was a characteristic of a city-state, or it was a characteristic of both of them. So there are there are 7 different markers to drag here. We have a passage-based prompt, which will come into play again for later questions. If we're making them read this much on an assessment, it's not just going to be for the one question. This will be something that they can access and that we will tell them to access multiple times throughout it. So question 11 starts to get into the inventions piece. Which of the above inventions had the most significant influence on the economy and trade in ancient China? Be sure to describe the invention and explain why you think it was economically significant. So lots of things in play here. They could use the passage. They could use anything from a number of different activities that they'll go through over the course of the unit. We move into questions 12 and 13, which we've got a fill style map here, and which is the one continent not linked by the Silk Road, and then use the passage on the previous slide as well as this map to describe how Europeans were affected by the cultural diffusion that happened along the Silk Road. So we're trying to get into that piece of it again, both from lessons 1 and 2. Another marker-based question where they will drag for questions 14 through 23. They'll drag each of these things, into where it was. Oh man, you know what? I guess I kind of need to make it a little more clear what the question is asking. So I think it's where these were coming from, but I'll have to look back at my notes because that part of it didn't transfer over to the assessment. So apologies. I will update that one probably tonight even. And then we get into the final 2 questions. Using your knowledge of history and any passages and maps on this assessment, explain how trade was a factor in the growth of the Roman Empire during Era 3. See rubric on the next slide. So for this one, we did 2 things. We've included a be sure to include for students. And then we've also included, you could choose to hide the slide or tweak the slide or have it just for you, but we've also given a rubric that can be used to score this particular question. And you can see we're really looking at the social, political, economic, and cultural. So again, that was another reason we had Becky talk about the SPEC strategy, because we've referenced it now both in the lessons and again on the assessment. And then the final question, question 25, are empires destined to fall? Create a claim that is backed with evidence to answer this question. And you can see we've got our bento box again. If you are, remember I said before, that counterclaim and rebuttal piece, if that's not a piece of it that you are teaching your kids, either they're not ready for it or, it hasn't come up in the year yet, you can always shade those boxes out or you can make them extra credit. But we've got a bento box style question to, again, give kids an opportunity to craft a claim in response to a compelling question and then point out the pieces of evidence that support their claim. So 25 question assessment for this one is available. Again, you can access it through the agenda. We can't put it up publicly because we're afraid kids will get a hold of it, even though in a lot of cases they're probably not going to know what it is that they're looking at without having had the requisite lessons taught to them by their teachers. But so the link to this is in the agenda document, as it always will be. We will have we will continue to develop assessments alongside of any tweaks to this for Unit 5 and 6. Unit 7 itself is a performance task, so there won't be an assessment for Unit 7 because Unit 7 is the assessment, if that makes sense. But we will have one for religions, and you can take some of those questions in January that will show you and put them on previous tests if you're teaching religion in the era in which the religion creeps up. Or if you do the religion unit as we present it as its own standalone thing, you'll have one for that too. So any questions over the assessment? Any questions over anything we've covered tonight? Hearing none, we are going to give you the gift of 17 early minutes out. Do not tell the Michigan Department of Education. We won't if you won't. So if you're going for sketches, you'll still get the full 2 sketches for tonight or 3 sketches for tonight from our 3 sketch piece. But I'll let Becky and Phil add anything else that they want to add. But I personally hope all of you have a very restful, relaxing holiday break. I hope that you all turn your email off. I hope that you don't grade anything. I hope you drink lots of eggnog. And I just hope that your holidays are wonderful and a chance to recharge. We're in another crazy year. I hope I don't have to keep saying this, but I'm tired of living in unprecedented times, and it doesn't seem to be ending anytime soon. So Hopefully, you can take the 2 weeks or the week and a half, whichever it is that you have off, and take it completely off. Watch bad movies, eat all the cookies, do whatever you need to rest and recharge. And we'll see you back here in January. Phil, Becky, any final words?
I ditto what Dave just said.
All right. You guys have a fantastic evening, and we will see you back here in January when we come back together to talk about religion.